The research base had become a tomb. Emergency lighting flickered in erratic bursts, casting long, shifting shadows across the steel corridors. The air reeked of blood, burnt flesh, and something far worse, a cloying organic odor that seeped into the walls like rot. The sounds of the base, once a symphony of humming machinery and faint, calm chatter, were replaced by the intermittent scrape of claws against metal and the low, wet gurgle of things that had once been human. Ilara crouched in the corner of the lab, her breathing shallow. Her hands trembled as she rechecked the mixture in her injector. It was a desperate concoction, a blend of antiviral agents, genetic stabilizers, and a shot of adrenaline that might slow the progression of her infection, or kill her outright. Either way, she didn't have a choice. The alien filaments spreading under her skin, writhing like worms beneath the surface, had begun to push through in places, sprouting thin, translucent growths that shimmered faintly in the dim light. "Do it, Ilara," she whispered to herself, biting down on a piece of gauze. She plunged the injector into her arm. Pain seared through her veins, a white-hot fire that made her scream, muffled by the gauze. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she might pass out. But then the pain began to subside, leaving behind a strange numbness. The filaments retracted slightly, their movements slowing. "Ilara!" Mason's voice crackled over the comms, startling her. "Where the hell are you? We need to regroup. It's spreading faster than we thought." "I'm in Lab 3, she replied, her voice weak. "What's the status?" There was a pause. Mason's voice, when it came back, was grim. "Kara's gone. One of those things got her." Ilara closed her eyes, her stomach twisting. Kara had been the strongest of them, the one who never faltered. If she was gone, their odds of survival had plummeted. And the artifact? "Still in the core chamber," Mason said. "It's growing. The tendrils have spread through half the base. It's like it's consuming everything, using the metal and organic material to build something. I don't know what, but it's alive." "I know what it's building," Ilara said quietly. "A nest. It's turning the base into an incubator." "For what?" Mason's voice was sharp, edged with panic. Ilara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The artifact's purpose was clear now. It wasn't just about infection. It was about transformation. It wanted hosts, vessels to carry its creator's legacy. And if they didn't stop it, it would succeed. Ilara met Mason in the corridor near the armory. His face was streaked with blood, and his armor was dented and burned. But he was alive. He handed her a plasma rifle without a word, his eyes scanning the flickering shadows behind her. "We need to destroy the artifact," he said finally. "Whatever it takes." Ilara nodded. "It's not going to be easy. It's connected to everything now. The longer we wait, the stronger it gets." "We don't have time to wait." Mason gestured toward the vents overhead. A wet, slithering noise echoed through the ducts. "They're hunting us." "They?" Mason's expression darkened. "Luke wasn't the only one it got to. There are more of them now, mutated, faster, stronger. They know the base better than we do, and they're working together. It's like they're connected, like the artifact is controlling them." As if on cue, a guttural howl erupted from the far end of the corridor, followed by the pounding of claws on metal. Mason raised his rifle. "Run!" The two of them sprinted through the twisting corridors, the sound of their pursuers growing louder. The creatures, mutated forms of their former crewmates, were relentless. Their distorted bodies moved with an inhuman grace, limbs bending at unnatural angles as they climbed walls and crawled through vents. One of them lunged from the shadows, its elongated arms swiping at Mason. He spun and fired, the plasma bolt tearing through its torso. The creature shrieked but kept coming, its exposed ribcage glistening with alien growths. Ilara fired next, aiming for its head. The creature collapsed in a heap, its limbs twitching spasmodically. "We can't keep fighting them," Mason panted. "They're not stopping." "We don't need to fight them," Ilara said, her mind racing. "We just need to get to the core chamber." They reached the engineering deck where the artifact's influence was most pronounced. The walls were covered in a fleshy, pulsating mass that oozed a viscous fluid. Tendrils snaked across the floor and ceiling, some of them twitching as if aware of their presence. "It's alive," Mason muttered, his voice filled with disgust. Ilara nodded, her grip tightening on her rifle. "It's more than alive. It's thinking." The tendrils reacted as they approached the core chamber, retracting and then surging forward like living traps. Mason fired at them, the plasma bolts burning through the organic material, but more tendrils grew in their place. Ilara dodged one that lashed out at her, narrowly avoiding its barbed tip. "We're running out of time," she said, her voice strained. "Cover me." Mason nodded, unleashing a barrage of fire at the advancing tendrils, while Ilara sprinted toward the artifact. It loomed in the center of the chamber, now grotesquely massive, its tendrils fused with the base's systems. The artifact's surface pulsed with an eerie light, and she could feel its presence in her mind, a deep, invasive whisper that promised enlightenment and power. Ilara ignored it, focusing instead on the device in her hand. It was a destabilizer, a crude but powerful explosive designed to disrupt energy fields. If she could plant it directly on the artifact, it might be enough to destroy it. As she approached, the whispers grew louder. The artifact's tendrils lashed out, but she dodged them, her movements fueled by adrenaline and desperation. She reached the base of the artifact and slammed the destabilizer onto its surface. The artifact screamed. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but a psychic wave that hit her like a physical blow. Images flooded her mind, visions of alien worlds consumed by the artifact, civilizations twisted into monstrous forms, entire planets reduced to breeding grounds for its creator's offspring. She saw herself among them, her body transformed, her mind enslaved. "Ilara!" Mason's voice snapped her out of the visions. He was still firing, his shots holding the tendrils at bay. "Do it now!" She activated the destabilizer, the device's timer beginning to count down. The artifact's screams grew louder, and the entire chamber began to shake. Tendrils surged toward her, but Mason stepped in front of her, taking the brunt of the attack. "Mason!" she screamed as the tendrils impaled him, lifting him off the ground. "Go!" he shouted, blood pouring from his mouth. "Finish it!" Ilara hesitated for only a moment before turning and running. The artifact's death throes shook the entire base, and she could feel the tendrils retreating as the destabilizer reached its final seconds. She barely made it out of the chamber before the explosion ripped through the base, the force of it throwing her to the ground. When she looked back, the core chamber was engulfed in flames, and the artifact was gone. But as she lay there, gasping for breath, she noticed something clinging to her arm. Tiny, translucent spores, glowing faintly in the darkness. It wasn't over. Not yet. The remains of the research base creaked and groaned, the sound echoing through the scorched ruins. The explosion had torn through the core chamber, incinerating everything in its path. The artifact was gone, or at least it seemed that way. But Elara knew better. The alien spores clinging to her arm pulsed faintly, a reminder that its influence was far from extinguished. She staggered through the collapsed corridors, her body trembling from exhaustion and the infection coursing through her veins. Her vision blurred intermittently, the edges of her sight filled with writhing shadows that weren't really there. She pressed her hand to the wall to steady herself, her skin burning where it met the flesh-like growths that had spread through the base. "Elara, focus," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. She couldn't afford to falter now, not when she was so close to the end. Ahead, the remnants of the artifact's core chamber glowed faintly. The explosion hadn't destroyed it entirely. Instead, it had revealed its true form, a writhing mass of tendrils and organic structures embedded deep within the base. The artifact had used the energy of the blast to evolve, shedding its shell and transforming into something even more horrifying. Elara approached cautiously, her rifle clutched tightly in her hands. The tendrils twitched as she neared, sensing her presence. She could feel it probing her mind, whispering promises of power and unity. The whispers had grown louder since the explosion, their seductive pull almost impossible to resist. "You can still save them," the voice said, soft and insistent. "Join us. Become more than you are. You will save humanity, Elara. You will save them all." She shook her head, trying to block out the voice. "You don't want to save humanity," she muttered. "You want to consume it." "No," the voice replied, and this time it sounded almost sorrowful. "We are survival. We are evolution. Without us, your species will perish. You cannot stop what must happen." Elara's grip on the rifle tightened. She knew she couldn't fight it directly. Its influence was too vast, its reach too deep. But there was one thing the artifact hadn't anticipated, her willingness to destroy herself, to stop it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the last vial of the destabilizing compound she had created. It was unstable, experimental, a chemical cocktail that would react violently with the alien spores in her body. If it worked, it would kill the artifact at its source. If it didn't, well, she wouldn't live long enough to regret it. Elara. The voice was sharper now, angrier. The tendrils surged toward her, snapping like whips as they closed the distance. "Do not deny us. You are already ours." She injected the compound directly into her arm. The reaction was instantaneous. Pain exploded through her body, every nerve igniting in white-hot agony. She screamed, collapsing to her knees, as her veins burned with the alien substance fighting back against the chemical assault. Her vision went black for a moment, and when it returned, the tendrils were writhing violently, their movements erratic and disorganized. The artifact screamed, not in words, but in a psychic wave that radiated pure hatred. The ground beneath her feet cracked, and the walls trembled as the entire structure began to collapse. Elara forced herself to stand, her legs shaking beneath her, and aimed her rifle at the artifact's pulsing core. "This ends now," she said through gritted teeth. She fired. The plasma bolt struck the core, and the destabilizing compound in her veins reacted with the spores still connected to the artifact. The explosion that followed was unlike anything she'd ever seen, a blinding light that consumed the chamber and sent a shockwave rippling through the base. Elara was thrown backward, her body slamming into the wall as the tendrils disintegrated around her. When the light faded, there was nothing left of the artifact. The tendrils were gone, the whispers silenced. The base was crumbling around her, but for the first time the oppressive weight of the artifact's presence was gone. Elara tried to stand, but her body refused to obey. She looked down at her arm and saw that the alien filaments were gone, burned away by the compound. But the damage was done. Her skin was blistered and raw, her veins blackened where the infection had been purged. She knew she didn't have much time. Footsteps echoed in the distance, and she turned her head weakly. Mason emerged from the shadows, his face pale and streaked with blood. He was limping, his armor cracked and his rifle missing, but he was alive. "Elara," he said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and horror. "What the hell did you do?" She tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "I stopped it." He crouched beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly, as if he didn't know where to touch without causing her more pain. "You're dying," he said softly. "I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "But it's gone, Mason. The artifact, it's gone." Mason's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like he might argue, but then he nodded, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "You did it," he said. "You saved us." Elara closed her eyes, her body growing colder. She felt the weight of the artifact lifting from her mind, the whispers finally silenced. For the first time in days, her thoughts were her own. But as the darkness began to take her, a faint glow caught her attention. She opened her eyes and saw something clinging to Mason's armor, a tiny spore, translucent and shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her heart sank. "Mason," she said weakly, her voice trembling, "it's not over." He followed her gaze and froze, his face going pale. The spore pulsed once, twice, and then disappeared, sinking into the fabric of his suit. The last thing Elara saw before the darkness claimed her was Mason's horrified expression and the faint shimmer of alien light spreading across his skin. The rescue team arrived weeks later, responding to the distress beacon that had been activated during the explosion. They found the base in ruins, the atmosphere thick with ash and debris. There were no survivors, but in the debris field they found something strange, a faint, bioluminescent growth spreading across the remains of the base. It pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if waiting for someone or something to find it. And far away in the void of space, a rescue pod drifted silently. Inside, Mason Vrel sat in the pilot's chair, his eyes glowing faintly with a light that wasn't entirely his own. The artifact's work was far from finished. It had found a new vessel, and this time there would be no stopping it.